I'm Kerry Lee Barry. When I was at school, we only ever learnt that Captain Cook sailed to Australia in 1788 to peacefully settle this country. It's only quite recently that I, like so many other Australians, are learning that there is another side to this story. My identity, how I see myself, is tied up with my past, my history if you like. I'm of both Aboriginal and European descent, so I'm affected by the histories of both races and particularly the experiences, the good and the bad, of my ancestors on both sides. Whether we are Indigenous or non-Indigenous Australians, in order to be able to understand who we are today, it is essential that the history of this country is told as it really was, not as people would like it to have been. For Aboriginal people, the history of white settlement in Australia is not about discovery and peaceful settlement, or even hardy pioneers and bold explorers. Instead, we see invasion and violence. And perhaps above all, we see the stealing of our land. It's this violence and theft of land in the past which lies behind many of the problems which Indigenous Australians face today. For a long time, Australian history was told as if there was only one point of view, the white one. But today, the Indigenous view is being strengthened by the studies of people such as Professor Henry Reynolds. He and others have written about the violence on the frontier and asked the question, why weren't we, the white people, told the truth about our history? So there's not just one version of our history, there are competing versions. Our view will depend on such things as what aspects of the past we've chosen to study, what our values are, what our own racial background is, and what society, especially the media and our families, has taught us already. It will also depend on any new information which may be uncovered, and whether we're prepared to listen to it and take it into account. This program presents an overview of the history of Indigenous Australia after the country was colonised in 1788. For Indigenous people, the frontier is the first part of the shared history with Europeans. It began in 1788, but a flag in the ground does not mean actual occupation or control of a country. Frontier is the name for the places where that control is being established. As you can see from the map, it was a moving frontier, and the frontier period lasted until the 20th century in some parts of Australia. The British occupied Australia on the basis of what's known in British law as terra nullius, which means that in their opinion, the land was owned by no one. The Aborigines didn't live in houses with fences, they didn't grow crops or keep cattle or sheep, and that, said the British government, allows us to claim it in the name of the King. So, with the stroke of a pen, British law replaced Indigenous law. The experience of people on the frontier varied from person to person and place to place, but it generally included the same basic results. Many deaths and illnesses, increasing difficulties in hunting and food gathering, banishment from usual campsites, and difficulties performing ceremonies or caring for sacred sites. Indigenous people responded by fighting the invader or by trying to enter into some kind of agreement or arrangement that would allow them to survive in the new situation. They acted, for example, as guides, pastoral workers, domestic help, and native police.
What you had in general was this occupying force of whites moving out and into the more remote areas, and you had Aboriginal people fighting to stay on their land. The inequality of this battle was quite dramatic. There seemed to be this mentality that shooting any group of Aboriginal people was justified in terms of the killing of perhaps one or two white people. They do not seem to have taken notice even of the existing laws in terms of killings, which should have required at least some identification of a culprit as being somebody who could have been guilty of carrying that out and who after that was proved guilty of carrying out.
Well, it is estimated that across Australia, wherever the European invasion hit, the Indigenous population was reduced by 85% within the first generation of contact with Europeans. That is, 60% through introduced diseases, particularly smallpox, and the other 25% is attributed to resistance warfare. According to the thinking of the time, the mindset of the time, the decline of the Aboriginal population was rationalised on the basis that Indigenous people were a backward people, fading before the arrival of a more civilised society. And these were old theories and ideologies that had their roots in social Darwinism. One term that is used in international law to describe such decline or mistreatment, atrocities if you like, is genocide. And that is a deliberate and systematic attempt by one group to wipe out another group. Is an appropriate terminology which can be used particularly when you're looking at Aboriginal European relations within the first generation of contact in Australia.
When concerned people in Britain learnt about what was happening in Van Diemen's Land, they tried to improve the situation for Indigenous people in the rest of the country. So, when the Port Phillip district, now Victoria, was being settled in the 1840s, the government set up a system to protect the Aborigines, but it had little support from the settlers and was discontinued after a few years. Many other reserves, missions and stations were established by the government and churches, mostly after the 1840s, in order to protect Aborigines. They usually chose to separate Aborigines from the towns and place them on the only available land, which was often remote and not wanted by the settlers.
There were many people that protested the terrible circumstances of Aboriginal people who'd been excluded from land and were dying in conditions of starvation and disease. And many people said the state is earning millions of pounds from leasing this land, and yet we're only paying back a few pounds to look after these people whose land it was. It's probably those sorts of discussions which gave impetus to the setting up of missions as a way of taking care of people who had been evicted from their land. But also in that whole missionary stance was the notion of teaching Aboriginal people to be useful citizens, to be able to fit into the white culture.
Indigenous people were faced with very few alternatives. Many chose the reserves and missions as their best way to survive on their own land and with their own people. Others were virtually forced onto the reserves against their will. Over time, the laws and regulations governing the reserves tended to become more oppressive as they controlled more and more aspects of people's lives. And they did so in some places right up until the 1960s and 70s.
No Indigenous residents of the reserve or even the elected spokespeople were consulted, or any matters were discussed with the residents. They were just top-down decisions made by the board, which had total control.
The board had rights that no Aboriginal parent could be the legal guardian of their children. So in that itself, Aboriginal children were taken away because the board said so. On the missions and reserves, the education process was minimal. Sometimes the wife of the supervisor was the teacher of the children, a person who had no experience in teaching. People were taken from the minimal schooling that they did do and were shipped out, the women to work as domestics and the young boys to work in the pastoral industry. So what we have is a situation where in some cases, yes, there was security, but that was just minimal to what had happened.
Assimilation was a policy which aimed to make Aborigines the same as other Australians. The idea was they would disappear as a separate group altogether. State governments across Australia introduced this policy at different times, but in the 1930s all agreed on assimilation as the best way forward. In Victoria and New South Wales, this meant that those of mixed descent were forced off reserves into white society. Many children were put into orphanages and other institutions or were adopted by white families.
It was deemed legislatively that those Aboriginal people that had any sort of white ancestry, they were better off away from their Aboriginal family and the kinship systems and those who supported them, and it was deemed that they go to the nearest town and live there. It was expected not only to live there, to find shelter, but to find employment.
The change of policy to assimilation, which was this full-on absorption of Aboriginal people into mainstream society. Policy itself is based on some rather racist assumptions in that it is saying that the majority of society into which the Indigenous people are assimilating is superior and has better values. So the expectation is that the Indigenous people have to forego their cultural values and beliefs to fit in to this concept of assimilation.
How could that policy of stealing kids from their families, and many of those young people never ever found their families again, how could that have happened in this country in the last few decades? Well, it did. And it did happen because there was a view that there should be a breeding out of Aboriginal people, and that was very much the view last century, and it just continued on. So policies and practices last century and this century have been devastating for Indigenous people.
Those who were forced off the reserves were not well prepared to enter white society. They'd had little experience of handling money and often faced a very racist community which did not want to give equal pay or conditions to black workers. Over time, conditions on reserves and missions often became stricter and governments gave less and less money for basic services. In the 1930s, Indigenous people began to form political organisations to fight for basic civil rights.
William Cooper and Jack Patton and Bill Ferguson organised what became known as the Day of Mourning. Remember that in 1938, which coincided with the Sesquicentenary centenary, 150th anniversary or celebration, if you like, of European settlement. Because the opposing view, the Indigenous view, was that it wasn't a day of celebration, it was a day of mourning.
In the late 1960s, the emphasis of government policies was changed from assimilation to integration. This was a halfway position which still moved Aboriginal people into mainstream society, but allowed them to hold on to their own cultural identity and Aboriginality, similar to the policy of multiculturalism for migrant groups today. This integration policy was applied to those still on reserves and missions, as well as those living on the fringes of country towns.
Now, in the 1960s, there was a move across Australia that Aboriginal people should be accorded equal rights, and that, in fact, rather than being kept separately on missions or settlements or reserves, they should be given the same choices and opportunities as other Australians, as white Australians, to live, initially it was said, as and like a white Australian in the general community. It was a move to reduce the expenses to the state.
Prior to the 1960s, most Aborigines did not have a vote. They were not paid equal wages, and the federal government could not make laws for their benefit. But there was a great deal of change in that decade. In 1962, Aborigines were given the vote in federal elections. Equal pay in the pastoral industry was granted in 1968. The modern land rights movement began with the Yirrkala Bark Petition in 1963, and in 1966 there was the Wave Hill strike by the Gurindji people in protest at their appalling wages and living conditions. The The successful campaign for the yes vote in the 1967 referendum was also very significant. Its success meant that Aboriginal people would finally be counted in the census and that the Commonwealth Government was now able to make national laws for the benefit of Aboriginal people. The 1970s saw the growth of calls for land rights and self-determination. Indigenous people in Australia wanted to control their own lives. In 1972, young activists set up the Aboriginal Tent Embassy outside Parliament House in Canberra. Australia and the world began to take notice. Aboriginal organisations like the Legal and Health Services were set up around Australia. In 1975, the Racial Discrimination Act made it illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of race. Campaigns for land rights were successful. The 1976 Northern Territory Act, for example, meant that traditional Aboriginal land in the Northern Territory could be granted to Aboriginal land trusts. In the 1980s, there were a number of important state land rights decisions. Uluru was handed back to its traditional owners in 1985. Indigenous people marked the 1988 bicentennial with a huge Invasion Day march in Sydney. Many leaders called for constitutional changes recognising Aboriginal rights and the status of Aborigines as the prior owners of this land. In 1990, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC, was established. In 1991, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody published its final report, and the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation was set up. In 1992, the re-establishment of the Tent Embassy on the lawns of the old Parliament House raised issues of nationhood and sovereignty. The Mabo decision in 1992 acknowledged Indigenous prior ownership in the form of native title. 1997 saw the completion of the National Inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. The report on the stolen generations brought a strong response from the Australian community, but not from the government. There is now a National Sorry Day.
Then we moved more towards self-determination in the Whitlam era or Koori control, I think it was the alternative term used by Koori people. That is, the desire to have control of your own affairs rather than to be herded along under government policies designed and constructed by non-Aboriginal people in terms of the direction that Aboriginal people should take.
There have been many achievements in the late 20th century, but there is still a long way to go. Issues of lower life expectancy, poor health and housing, lower than average rates of employment and education, and high rates of Indigenous people in custody all continue as major issues today. Acknowledgement of the history of the relations between the people of this country is an important part of the current struggle. Many people believe that this must happen before there can be reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
Policy has been very harsh in this country when it comes to Indigenous people. It's moved obviously forward, and we've had policies called self-determination, but what is so important for people to understand is that this notion that Aboriginal people can forget the past and move on and get on with life is incredibly rude, because you don't expect anyone else to forget their past. You don't expect the Jewish people living in Australia that have just got, horrendous issues to deal with in terms of, for example, the Nazi Holocaust. We would never expect those people to forget it and move on. We would never expect, in the tradition of the Anzacs, returned soldiers to forget it and move on when they fought, and many of them gave their lives for Australia. So why on earth do people expect that Aboriginal people should be able to forget it and move on? It's just an absolutely inappropriate thought to have, because who we are, whether you're black or white or come from a non-English speaking background, you are what your history is. You are what your past is. And we should never expect anyone to forgo who they are or what their past is. The important thing is that Indigenous people are an incredibly significant part of the mosaic of people living in this country, and we should be afforded that respect and afforded the status of being the first peoples of this nation.